We will discuss this topic in more detail with our guest. Pavel Latushko, Deputy Head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, Head of the NAU. Hello, welcome.
Good evening. I greet you and all the viewers.
Pavel, Lukashenko's behavior has been really interesting lately. First, he calls Belarusians Russians but better ones. Then he says that he didn't say that. One moment, he allows Putin to station his Wagner troops. Well, he gives his territory, occupied by him, the dictator, so that another dictator can use it and threaten Ukraine. And not only that, balloons have flown into the Baltic states. So he's doing one thing, then another. And now, when he said that we are not going to attack anyone, we want to be friends with Ukraine, there was such a statement after all. Now he is building this kind of serious military base, which will become a very convenient hub for Putin in case he wants to open another front to go after the Baltic states or to intensify attacks, perhaps even of a ground nature on Ukraine. Why do you think this construction of the century is happening? Why this railway? And why is Lukashenko allowing all of this on his territory right now?
Well, Lukashenko is a chameleon. In principle, he has been carrying out this policy for many years, for decades. There is nothing surprising about this. If we are talking about a specific event or the information that has come in about the construction of a training ground near the Ukrainian border, this is the implementation of those plans that were defined by Lukashenko back in 2023 to create the Southern Operational Command, which will be located, or one could say is already located, in the Gomel region of Belarus, near the border with Ukraine. At that time, a decision was made to build military infrastructure, and subsequently, information was received that, as part of the state investment program, orders were placed for the construction of several military facilities, the implementation of which is scheduled to be completed by 2027. So the design and construction have been underway for several years now. The latest information, which I think has been discussed on your channel as well as in other Ukrainian media and independent Belarusian media, is the creation of the 37th Separate Air Assault Brigade of the Special Operations Forces, the 4th Brigade of the Special Operations Forces, in addition to the Vitebsk, Brest, and Mogilev ones, which will now be located and is already partially located in the Gomel region. In order to create military units there, it is clear that infrastructure needs to be built. And this information about the creation of railway infrastructure, the construction of a training center, that is a firing range, confirms the implementation of these plans. Well, it is planned to create separate railway infrastructure where 60 train cars can be unloaded. At the same time, both heavy-duty vehicles and tracked vehicles can be delivered there. That is, everything is being created from the perspective of the need for the rapid delivery of military equipment near the border with Ukraine. It is said that the construction will be completed sometime by 2027. Lukashenko is systematically preparing for war, but this does not mean, of course, I do not want to justify him here in any way. I obviously consider him absolutely a criminal who committed the crime of aggression against Ukraine and a number of others responsible for what he has done in relation to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. But he would not want to enter the hot phase of the war. He understands that this is directly linked to his continued stay in power in Belarus, because Belarusian society is mostly pacifist. They would not want the Belarusian armed forces or Belarus itself to be dragged into a real hot armed conflict. But Lukashenko understands that he is on Putin's hook. Who is to blame for this? It is solely Lukashenko's fault, who, throughout his 32 years in power, has defined one single priority in foreign policy. That is the Russian Federation. Subsequently, having lost the election in 2020 by a landslide and falsifying it again in 2025, he fell into complete dependence on Putin. Therefore, in 2022, he fulfilled the task, the promise he made to Putin, because Putin supports him and keeps him in power. Therefore, there will come a moment when, theoretically, though I would not want to see this in reality, Lukashenko will once again support the military plans of the Russian Federation, just as he did in 2022. Well, in this situation, it's better to be prepared for what might inevitably happen, or what could theoretically happen, than to just sit on the sidelines and wait for something terrible to occur. That is why he's carrying out all these measures, including the construction of a military training ground. So, once again, this additional Southern Operational Command that has appeared in Belarus, this is the creation of specific military units, this is the construction of infrastructure supporting these military units, military towns, and training grounds.
I was really pleased by the reaction of the people in Belarus when these wild berries started burning one after another. And the entrepreneurs, one of them, he's the most popular one. I don't remember his name or where he's from. Well, anyway, he's clearly not the most representative of the titular nation of this federation. So he says, I'm moving my business to Belarus. And people started writing in the comments, please don't, anything, anywhere, just not here. You're the last thing we need here. These are the kinds of sentiments in society. Yes, if you can even call it that. Well, Lukashenko might have the goal of both stretching the front line and helping Putin distract the armed forces of Ukraine from the Donetsk direction. So there were also various possible scenarios for how events could unfold. But what's also interesting is that he suddenly gave an order to check a combat readiness of the army. According to the Secretary of the Security Council of Belarus, the so-called Alexander Volfovich, Lukashenko made this decision because of the visit of CIA Director John Ratcliffe to Moscow. As part of the inspection, one of the brigades will leave its permanent deployment site and will carry out, I quote, a number of tasks. Special attention is allegedly planned to be paid to methods of fire engagement against a potential adversary. Well, that's the information we have. Here, of course, it seems that there are some backroom agreements as well as fears of escalation. And to what extent is Lukashenko risking that by militarizing himself now and strengthening his army? The people, with these social sentiments, yes, which is where I started this conversation with you about how they don't want Russia, they don't want Russian citizens, and they don't want Russian money, might react. To what extent can the army actually become the lever and tool that helps Lukashenko finally retire? Let's call it that.
Well, let's try to figure out what exactly Lukashenko announced, and whether this is really connected, for example, to the CIA director's visit to Moscow. I'm still not inclined to claim that. And yet, Alexander Volfovich, state secretary of the Security Council of the Lukashenko regime, did not link this to the CIA director's visit. These exercises, or the sudden combat readiness check of the armed forces, was announced 3 days ago in one of the artillery brigades in Belarus. Volfovich commented on this by saying that yes, they will now be conducting such unscheduled inspections in order to see how military leadership is being carried out by the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Belarus over combat units on the territory of Belarus. I assume that this will not be a one-off case, not a single instance, so it did, after all, take place 3 days ago. This is in contrast to what took place in January. Let's not forget that Lukashenko has been conducting military exercises since the very beginning of the year. This includes January to March, a snap combat readiness inspection, a check of the combat use of nuclear weapons, and constant checks of territorial defense. And here, this is, well, another example, so to speak. Here, the order is given, by the way, directly through the Minister of Defense. And by the way, back in January to March, orders were given bypassing the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, directly to the commanders of units and formations in Belarus. The second thing that is happening, just yesterday, Air Force and Air Defense exercises were announced in Belarus. And by the way, these exercises are aimed at repelling possible air attacks on military facilities and military units on the territory of Belarus. I assume that we are talking about possible drone attacks. These exercises will run until September 10th and will consist of two parts. First on the territory of Belarus, and subsequently at the Ashaluk training ground in the Russian Federation with the combat use of air defense systems by Belarusian military personnel. And a third thing that is happening? On August 25th, comprehensive command staff exercises of the Belarusian Ministry of Internal Affairs began in the Minsk region. That is, they are effectively training on how the Ministry of Internal Affairs will operate under conditions of a possible declaration of martial law. On August 25th to 26th, the Ministry of Defense announced territorial troop exercises in two regions. Yesterday, they took place in the Minsk region. Today, they are taking place in the Grodno region. It is about checking how people's militia units are formed and how they react in conditions of combat events on the territory of Belarus. Moving on. From August 25th through 27th, the Ministry of Defense is conducting an inspection of military commandant's office activities. Well, this is, relatively speaking, so that it's easier to understand, it's the military traffic police, right? Which regulates traffic there and ensures order in the armed forces. So such exercises are taking place. And it gets even bigger. They are even conducting exercises for military propagandists. 24 military propagandists, representatives of state media, have been sent to one of the Special Operations Forces brigades so that they can be taught how to cover events in wartime conditions. But I'm not stopping there. Next, In the Minsk region today, command staff exercises on dispersing demonstrations took place. That is, Lukashenko assumes that if martial law or military actions occur in Belarus, then it is possible, and one cannot rule it out, that there will be protests among the people. Today, they were demonstrating how they will suppress these mass protests. They were even building little towns there. In Sitovici, for example, a new training ground is being built for the Kimorvka, which we were just talking about, yes, just now. This is already the creation of infrastructure. In Osipovici, exercises are also taking place with officers who are graduates of military departments subordinate to the general staff of the armed forces of Belarus. So you can imagine that right now, these days, comprehensive measures are underway to ensure the military readiness of the armed forces of Belarus, the territorial defense forces, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Belarus for the development of some, well, unpleasant events. So this includes increasing combat readiness, its territorial defense, and at the same time, it's the Ministry of Internal Affairs system, how it suppresses protests. So these are comprehensive measures. Lukashenko is, of course, preparing for war, but I don't want to raise panic here and say that he would want this war. Once again, I'm saying he is not interested in war because it would create a threat to his continued stay in power. But he understands that at some point, Putin might use levers of influence, pressure him, and then, well, it's better, as they say, to be prepared. Perhaps this is, among other things, an intimidation measure, like showing, look, Ukraine, I'm preparing for something here, showing the West, among others, that I, let's say, have a certain amount of strength. So it's a kind of psyop. I wouldn't rule out that this is also a fairly big question, and we often ask it, where do such resources come from? Who is financing this? I can assume that the funding for all these military activities and exercises, at least since the beginning of this year, is being carried out not only by the budget of the Republic of Belarus, which has grown fivefold over the last 4 years, the military budget has grown, but also by the Russian Federation.
And we see that Putin is trying to carry out mobilization. And these battalions that he is assembling, they're conducting recruitment in Africa. By the way, I was listening to an interview today where a prisoner was talking about how he had 2.3 million in his account, but the money, once it hits the account, it just disappears right away as soon as they're sent on an assault. So what's the logic there, right? Meaning a person goes on an assault, they won't need the money anymore because the commanders have no intention of bringing this combat unit back to base and losing money. That's the kind of business, yes, that the Russian Federation has with these mercenaries. Recruitment's happening in Belarus. How successful are the Russians at luring in?
Unfortunately, yes. I can confirm this information. During our stay in Kyiv, when we met with the President of Ukraine and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, we had a meeting at the coordination headquarters. And then, at that time, in May, we received information that 2,871 mercenaries, citizens of Belarus, had signed contracts with the armed forces of the Russian Federation. 440 had already died at that time, 86 were missing in action, and 22 had been taken prisoner by Ukraine. And then, while speaking with one of the prisoners of war, a citizen of Belarus, I asked him a question. How exactly did you sign up for the armed forces of Ukraine? Where did you find this information? He said that he received this information on a Belarusian website. Subsequently, he approached the military enlistment office in Belarus, and the military enlistment office was aware that he had gone to the Russian Federation and signed a contract. So this is an example of the fact that at the level of the Ministry of Defense and the general staff, they are absolutely aware. Well, if people like that come to the military enlistment office, they are going as recruits into the armed forces of the Russian Federation. But it gets even better. Just a couple of weeks ago, a website called zashitnik.by appeared in Belarus. By is the national domain, which is controlled by the Operational Analytical Center of the President of the Republic of Belarus, yes, Lukashenko. So this is a security agency that is personally subordinate to Lukashenko. No one can get a national domain without the consent of the Operational Analytical Center. This means the OAC, for short, gave its consent for this. This means the Belarusian special services were absolutely aware that on such a portal, citizens of Belarus could receive information on how to go to Belarus as mercenaries. This is yet another scheme. The third scheme that works is when people just go to work in the Russian Federation. They are offered jobs as security guards. They are offered work at a construction site. Subsequently, they arrive. We have several examples where Belarusian citizens sign contracts without looking, and as a result, they end up in the armed forces of the Russian Federation and make efforts to get out of it. And that is impossible. Some, this is another case, are bought through Russian citizenship. Well, I'll get myself a Russian passport, maybe I'll get some additional benefits. When you become a citizen of the Russian Federation, it already means that you can be mobilized into the armed forces of the Russian Federation and also end up in the war in these meat grinder assaults. Therefore, this is a very important problem. As of May, we were talking about 2,870 people. Unfortunately, this number is growing, and it is very important to convey this to Belarusians through the mass media. First of all, I don't understand. As a Belarusian politician, why you would even want to participate in this aggression when we have no grievances against Ukraine or the Ukrainian people, knowing that this is a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Belarus. By the way, aiding and abetting mercenary activities is also a crime. So the leadership of the Operational Analytical Center and the Ministry of Defense, the ministers and chiefs of the general staff, are effectively committing a criminal offense. The very fact of getting into a contract, yes, or signing a contract, is already your own personal criminal offense. That carries a penalty of 7 to 10 years of imprisonment. So I don't understand why you are doing this. And on the other hand, it turns out that people, well, sometimes due to a lack of information, or maybe, I apologize to the viewers, due to simple naivety, end up in such situations. That is why it is important for us to talk about this, to inform people. Do not do this. It is pointless. You will simply return to Belarus, in coffins, yes. And as a result, by the way, usually no one will get any money either. Well, it's not about money at all, but about the prestige of a nation. Well, on the other hand, we have Belarusian heroes who are fighting in the Kalinowski Regiment and in other units of the armed forces of Ukraine, whom we bow down to. They are truly heroes because they are fighting a just cause. They are justly participating on the side of Ukraine because Ukraine is defending its territory from an aggressor who has violated international law.
We are immensely grateful to our defenders from Belarus. Actually, we still have literally 1 minute of airtime left. I can't help but ask you about August 24th, when the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko decided to congratulate the people of Ukraine on Independence Day. He suddenly declared, saying that the historical destinies of the Belarusian and Ukrainian peoples are closely intertwined. However, he made no mention of the fact that he has been helping Putin wage a full-scale war against Ukraine for over 4 years. He voiced a prediction, saying that despite geopolitical upheavals, that's what he calls it, the future generation of Belarusians and Ukrainians will preserve eternal friendly and kinship ties. You know, when I see and hear all of this, well, is it an outright mockery, or is it an attempt to shift the sanctions off himself a little bit? What do you think that was?
As absolutely reasonable people, I think we can agree this is the cynicism, baseness, and lies of this criminal who committed the crime of aggression against Ukraine by deciding to provide the territory of Belarus for Russian aggression against Ukraine. For this, he must be held accountable in a special tribunal, held accountable for the aggression against Ukraine. It's surprising that he is congratulating the Ukrainian people, but why is he doing it? Because he doesn't congratulate the leaders of countries that haven't recognized him. Although I would have liked to see how he would have congratulated Zelensky. Zelensky probably would have told him off, and I don't know, maybe even told him to shove it, as they say, and responded very harshly to such a congratulation. Well, Lukashenko, yes, he is a criminal, but he is playing to his domestic audience in Belarus. A part of society doesn't have access to objective information, after all. And he says, look at how peace-loving I am. I am for peace, after all. The second point is that this address will be translated into foreign languages and sent to foreign capitals. So look, I'm so kind. I want to be a mediator again. I'm for peace, after all. But on that same day, I'm finishing up now, he met with the governor of the Archangels region of the Russian Federation. And do you know what he said? He told him, we have to be on the front lines together with Russia. In other words, he disavowed that congratulatory message to the Ukrainian people. He confirmed that he is on the front lines together with Russia. That is cynicism and that is vile. Yes,